Hi, my name is Michaela. I'm going to be talking about my article that I found on test anxiety in children. And so, let's start the slide. So I titled it Ways of Teaching Gifted Children and Their Anxiety. I mean, this isn't the article title, but this is what I titled my presentation. The article itself was titled called The Dynamic Testing and Test Anxiety Amongst Gifted and Average Ability Children. And it had four different authors. It was Bart Vogler, Meryl Baker, Julian Elliott, and Wilma Zing. And then it was written and published by the British Psychological Society. And I found this article in our EBSCOhost Library Center online. The purpose of this article, or what they wanted to talk about and try to get an end result for, was dynamic testing, which they believed this study or this article was made in the UK and it was done in the Netherlands, but they wanted to do this thing called dynamic testing, which in the Netherlands, they found it was a possible method for children who experience anxiety to take this test. And this test they're trying to prove that it will lower anxiety for young children, or more importantly for children of gifted needs or special needs. And they wanted to focus on the children's potential to learn rather than the measurement of their previous learning. That's what that testing method was. So it didn't test what they were going to learn or what they already learned. It was what their potential was in the future, which I thought was great. It hadn't been tested on children, and so the purpose was they wanted to see how they would do this test and how they do against this test versus another one, which we'll talk about here later. And then another thing that you'll hear is the second test that they tested this one against was called an unguided test, which is a method of testing where they did everything or allow the children to do everything independently. And then halfway through doing the test, they watched a video, just because the scientists or people who did the experiment with the children, they wanted to make sure that the tests that were given out were both equally about the same amount of time, which is about 20 to 30 minutes. And so they did, for the unguided test, they added a short little video in between just to make sure the length of the tests were the same. They had multiple hypotheses. One of the two main ones that they had were they wanted to test if it was useful to conduct dynamic testing on children that were considered gifted. And for gifted children in the Netherlands, they wouldn't take a test necessarily like what we do for children in the US. It is completely different. If you were considered gifted children, it was because either one, the parent thought you were, like they're like, oh, my children needs help, and so they would put them in different classes to get help, or the teacher thought it'd be best for them. So it wasn't like they didn't test them to make sure that, like, oh, your child has ADD, or your child needs help and needs extra help. It was basically saying, like, if the parent thought their child needed it, then they needed it. Like, they didn't like it was honestly up to the parents. The second hypothesis that they talked about and tested for was would test anxiety be related to how well the children scored on the test, or if how their anxiety would fluctuate throughout testing. So here are the samples and methods of doing the test. On the left side, I took a box that they had in the article that I read. I just copy and pasted it just to go over that, because some of it you don't know unless you read it. And so what you have in the boxes are, so they had four different subgroups. They had the gifted, they had the dynamic training group, and then in that dynamic training group, they had the gifted group, which were 22 kids, and then the average children, which were 31. And then you had the unguided practice group, which had 23 gifted kids and 27 average kids. And their testing that they did was they each did two pre-tests, and then they would do a dynamic or static test in between, and then they do a post test. And then finally, they would both take a CTAS test, or basically it was just an anxiety test at the very end, asking questions if they felt anxious at the end of taking these tests. Their samples that they chose were 113 children from the ages of 7 and 8 that were in the Netherlands. And it was also talked about in the study that it was all kind of chosen randomly. It was, I can't think of the word right now, but the children, their parents offered for them to be in the study. And then it was categorized for the test. They took all these children when they first volunteered to participate in this experiment, and they would categorize them into, give them all the same test in the very beginning, which was called a Raven, to see where they stood on the level and if they're considered gifted or not. And they go from there how to spread out as much as possible who would go where. And they made the 2 pre-tests and the post-tests, and then the anxiety test at the very end. And here is the results. It's kind of hard to talk about, so I'll go over what all of these mean. So the M just stands for the mean score of what happened, like their scores throughout the very end. And then SD stood for their standard deviation of all of them, so how they deviated in all of them. Together, this group over here is the gifted children, and they have the dynamic training group from the gifted, and then the unguided training from the gifted. And then here you have the average children, who this is their dynamic training and this is their unguided training. From these test scores, they were able to show and prove that their method and hypothesis was correct. And this method is successful in improving the scores of children. And so they're trying to test whether or not this new training method, which is called dynamic training, would work or not for kids and their anxiety. I did see, however, also that no training benefits were found. And so nothing good or bad like fluctuated differently, or no like red lights popped up for them while they were testing. There was improvement in performance was shown in this dynamic testing versus unguided. And then also test anxiety overall for every child. In this study, gifted or not, test anxiety was shown to influence everyone's test methods across the entire experiment. Basically, this is just a study I found, and I thought it'd be very interesting to talk about children with test anxiety, how test anxiety affects children, and specifically how I was curious how it affect gifted children or kids with special needs, because I feel like they need certain tests. And I think having this dynamic training show that their test anxiety wouldn't be any more or less on this test than any other, and they had more benefits come out and it was more successful for improving their scores. That'd be great for not only special ed kids, but regular kids. And if their anxiety doesn't go up with this test, then this could be a test to think of and to bring into the environment. That is basically my presentation. Thank you.